The sound of bells slices through the blackness, pulling you from sleep. Mist forms with every exhale in the frigid dormitory as your trembling hands draw the coarse woolen robes over your body. You are only 8, and your bare feet, numb against the flagstone, have long ago forgotten the sensation of cold. All around you, a score of other girls dress in complete silence, their faces like pale wax in the slivers of light from the high, narrow windows. A girl, no older than 6, fumbles with her habit. The urge to assist her is strong, but the memory of Margaret's punishment is stronger. For whispering a word of solace to a sobbing child, Margaret was given no food for 3 days and forced to kneel on dried peas until her knees bled. This is not a place of learning or refuge. It is Whitby Abbey in the year 1247. You are here not by your own volition, but as a pawn in your father's strategy to forge an alliance with the church. Your childhood vanished 6 months ago when those immense oak doors slammed shut behind you. You know you will never embrace your mother again, never race through open meadows, or laugh freely. The sweetness of honey cakes and the comfort of a family hearth are now just fading memories. Your life for the next decade will be a lesson in survival, where perfect obedience is paramount, hunger is a sign of piety, and silence is your steadfast companion. As we delve into these long-forgotten tales of suffering and endurance, if you find value in uncovering the concealed realities of our past, please consider showing your support by liking this video and subscribing for more explorations. I would also love to read your comments about where in the world you're joining from. It's truly remarkable how our shared curiosity about history connects us across vast distances and through the centuries. Dawn is announced by the first bell at 4 in the morning. Here, the rising sun offers no comfort or promise, only another day of duty. Children, some as young as 6 or 7, struggle to their feet from straw-filled pallets, their limbs aching from the unforgivingly cold floors. Their breath condenses in the air while rats dart between the stones of their sleeping quarters. In Dorset, Shaftesbury Abbey, established in 888 AD, was a repository for daughters of noble families, deposited like inconvenient baggage. In 1043 AD, Lady Giva of Mercia delivered her youngest daughter, Edith, to this institution when the child was barely 5 years old. Political maneuvering demanded such sacrifices, and daughters were often treated as disposable assets in the high-stakes world of medieval influence. Fragments of Edith's story are preserved in the Abbey's chronicles, penned in precise Latin by Abbess Elfjafu. Parvula Edith, she recorded, wept inconsolably for 3 full days and nights. The morning chill froze the tears upon her face. She cried out for her mother in her Saxon dialect, but here we permit only Latin. It is necessary for her to understand that her mother is now lost to her, and the Lord is her sole father. Imagine these young girls navigating their first weeks. Their hair, once lovingly plaited by servants, is now crudely cut short to discourage vanity. Their soft, silken garments are exchanged for scratchy wool that irritates skin unaccustomed to its texture. Their hands, once shielded by fine gloves, are now chapped and raw from the cold and relentless chores. Lady Matilda Fitzwalter, who was sent to Godstow Abbey near Oxford in 1185 AD at the age of 8, managed to smuggle a letter to her sister years later. "I can still recall the flavor of marzipan and the feel of ermine fur on my cheek," she wrote. "Now, my only tastes are barley gruel and a rasp of rough hemp against my skin. At times, I question if those early memories were but a dream, as this world of stone feels too stark and real to have had any life before it." In these institutions, silence was not a virtue. It was a means of survival. From the first morning prayers until the last bell tolled at night, speaking was forbidden except when absolutely necessary for lessons or confession. The girls developed a language of gestures and glances. A tilted head could signal hunger. The way a prayer book was held might indicate sickness. A specific posture during Mass could communicate that someone was battling despair. At Barking Abbey in Essex, infamous for its severe discipline, The quiet was frequently shattered by the sound of leather meeting skin. The discipline chamber was a small stone room where girls were taken for transgressions as slight as smiling during prayers or being too slow in a procession. Sister Maynard, the disciplinarian from 1203 to 1219 AD, maintained meticulous records of punishments. Her logbook is a horrifying catalog of cruelty. Alicia, age 8, received 5 strokes with a rod for laughing during none. Marguerite, age 10, given 15 strokes for speaking during the scripture reading. Beatrix, age 6, held down and struck 10 times for wetting her bed. These were not rare events but daily rituals. Children existed in a state of perpetual anxiety. Terrified of making mistakes they couldn't comprehend were mistakes. Eleanor of Aquitaine's youngest daughter, Joanna, was placed in Fontevraud Abbey in France in 1176 AD at 12 years old. Her letters to her mother, unearthed in the abbey's archives centuries later, paint a portrait of a child slowly collapsing under the strain of constant scrutiny and punishment. "Dearest mother," she wrote, "I have learned to exist as a shadow and to breathe as a whisper. I was beaten yesterday for letting my mind drift during matins. How can they perceive my thoughts? I am afraid they can see into my very mind. I am afraid they can see my dreams of home." Food was not for sustenance. It was a mechanism of punishment and control. Children typically ate only once a day, maybe twice on fortunate occasions. The meals consisted of gruel, dark bread, and water. Meat was prohibited except for major feast days, and even then, it was distributed in meager portions. At Wilton Abbey in Wiltshire, the morning meal was a small piece of bread with a cup of water. Dinner was a thin barley porridge, sometimes with a few vegetables from the abbey's garden. Children who entered the convent plump and healthy from their noble households soon became gaunt, with hollowed cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for their faces. This starvation was deliberate, viewed as a spiritual exercise to subjugate the body to God's will. What the abbesses failed to recognize was that famished children cannot focus on their prayers or learn effectively. They grew obsessed with food, stashing away crusts of bread in their clothing and dreaming not of salvation, but of feasts. Agnes of Bohemia, the daughter of King Ottokar I, was sent to a Poor Clares convent in Prague in 1234 AD at the age of 9. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to her father, "Your daughter talks of nothing but eating. She marks the hours between meals. Her tears are not for your absence, but for the memory of roasted birds and sweetened wine. This is not piety, your majesty. This is desperation." Winter within these stone enclosures was exceptionally harsh. Heating was scarce, confined to small fires in the chapter house and possibly the scriptorium. The dormitories were left unheated, even as snow drifted against the windows and ice crusted over the water basins. Children huddled together for warmth in shared beds, often 3 or 4 to a single narrow straw mattress. At Nunneinster Abbey in Winchester, constructed in 903 AD, the dormitory was a long, narrow chamber without windows and only one small fireplace at the very end. The girls slept in all their clothes, yet still awoke with frostbitten fingers and toes. Lady Isabel de Clare, sent to Amesbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1248 AD at the age of 7, wrote in her memoirs as an adult, "I recall the sound of teeth chattering in the darkness, a sound like castanets played by unseen hands. I remember the girl beside me, Marie, barely 6 and newly arrived from Normandy. She spoke no English and cried for her nurse each night. One morning in February, she did not wake up. Her lips were the color of violets. They took her body away as we recited our morning prayers, and her name was never mentioned again. It was as though she had never been. Death was a frequent and unremarkable event. Children succumbed to the cold, to sickness, to poor nutrition, and to hopelessness. Abbey ledgers reveal mortality rates approaching 30% for girls under the age of 12. These deaths were noted factually, devoid of emotion or any inquiry. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the death roll for the year 1209 AD simply lists, Johanna, age 6, died of a fever on the feast of St. Michael. Marguerite, age 8, died of a wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke. Beatrix, age 7, died of consumption on the feast of St. Martin. There were no surnames, no notifications sent to families, no proper burials. They were laid to rest in unmarked graves in the convent cemetery, their existence reduced to brief lines in an account book. Education, when provided, was restricted to fundamental Latin literacy and the memorization of prayers. The majority of children learned just enough to follow along in their prayer books. Writing was taught to a select few, typically those destined for administrative roles within the convent. Mathematics was virtually absent. History was confined to Bible stories and the lives of saints. Science was deemed perilous, as it was thought to provoke questions about God's divine mysteries. At Lacock Abbey in Wiltshire, founded in 1229 AD, the curriculum involved memorizing psalms, learning to embroider church vestments, and studying the lives of female saints. Lady Ella of Salisbury, the abbey's founder, stated in its charter, "Let the young maids learn submission through Scripture, patience through needlework, and humility through the study of those holy women who suffered for Christ." There was no mention of arithmetic, medicine, healing, or any literature beyond religious tracts. These children were not being trained to think, but to obey. Physical punishment was not just tolerated. It was considered essential for spiritual growth. The rod, the strap, and fasting were seen as instruments of salvation. Children who displayed independence or creativity were beaten into conformity. At Dartford Priory in Kent, established in 1355 AD, the rule declared, "Spare not the rod, for it is through suffering that the young soul learns to love God above all earthly things." The abbess, Dame Joan Vaux, was known throughout England for her severe methods. She maintained a collection of willow switches in her quarters, each one marked with the name of a girl under her charge. Parents visiting their daughters might see the welts on their arms and backs, but would remain silent. To challenge the abbess was to challenge God himself. Sister Marguerite of Hainaut, who was a novice mistress at Poissy Abbey in France from 1298 to 1315 AD, wrote in her private journal, "Today, I struck young Blanche 20 times for asking why God permits suffering. She is 9 years old and wanted to know why her baby brother died, if God loves children. Such questions are dangerous. They foster doubt, and doubt is faith's enemy. It is better she learns through pain than through reason, for reason leads to perdition." Sleep was consistently interrupted for nightly prayers. Children were roused at midnight for matins, again at 3 a.m. for lauds, and once more at dawn for prime. Their developing bodies, already taxed by poor diet and cold, were further stressed by chronic sleep deprivation. At Godstow Abbey, where Rosamund Clifford, mistress to Henry II, was laid to rest in 1176 AD, the night bells chimed so often that the children fell into a strange state of sleepwalking. They would rise and recite prayers while barely awake, their eyes open but vacant, their voices merging in chants they knew from repetition, not comprehension. Lady Alice Fitzhugh, who spent 12 years at Godstow, starting in 1289 AD, wrote to her niece, "I learned to pray while asleep, to genuflect in my dreams, to sing psalms as my mind wandered to memories of sunshine and laughter. We were like clockwork toys, wound up each morning and set in motion by the bells. I was afraid that if the bells ever ceased, I would simply collapse, for I had forgotten how to move without their direction." Emotional connections were actively suppressed. Children were instructed that family love was a form of idolatry, that affection between friends was sinful, and that any bond with the earthly world was a barrier to salvation. At Elstow Abbey in Bedfordshire, where John Bunyan would later find inspiration for the Pilgrim's Progress, girls were forbidden from forming particular friendships. They were frequently moved between dormitories to disrupt any budding emotional ties. Letters from home were read aloud to the entire community to deny any private comfort. Gifts from families were confiscated and shared among all the children, erasing any sense of individual care or special affection. Dame Clemence of Barking, who governed Barking Abbey from 1173 to 1186 AD, enforced a policy of spiritual detachment that prohibited girls from speaking about their families or their former lives. "The past is death," she declared. "Only the present service to God is of consequence. Those who fixate on earthly affections will find no solace in prayer. Children who dared to mention their parents or siblings were punished with solitary confinement in stone cells, where they received only bread and water until they renounced their worldly attachments." Young Lady Maud de Braos, sent to a Conbury priory in Herefordshire in 1235 AD at the age of 8, wrote in a secret diary, "I try to picture my mother's face, but it fades more each day. Sister Agatha says this is a good thing, that I am learning to love God more than earthly things. But I feel no love for God. I feel only a void, as if something precious was carved from my chest with a blunt knife. I act holy, but inside I am becoming hollow." Physical abuse was not limited to formal punishments. Children were routinely struck for minor mistakes, pinched for daydreaming, and slapped for showing any emotion. At Romsey Abbey in Hampshire, where the future St. Christina of Markyate took refuge in 1114 AD, the daily schedule included what was delicately called correction. This involved the methodical use of physical intimidation to ensure compliance. The children learned to flinch at sudden gestures, to keep their gaze lowered, and to speak only when addressed. The scriptorium at Shaftesbury Abbey holds a manuscript illuminated by a young girl named Adelheid in 1267 AD. In the margins, almost invisibly, she sketched tiny figures of children with tears on their faces. These marginalia were only found in 1923 during the manuscript's restoration. Art historians suggest these were clandestine messages, a way to convey pain and fear that could not be spoken. The drawings are simple but deeply moving. Stick-figure children with huge eyes, hands covering their mouths, and bodies hunched as if in perpetual terror. Sexual abuse, though not officially recorded, is documented in confession records and private correspondence. At Warewell Abbey in Hampshire, founded in 986 AD, Father Edmund the Confessor wrote to his bishop in 1278 AD, "I am distressed by what I hear in the confessional. Young girls speak of improper touching by older nuns, of being forced to lie with sisters for warmth in ways that violate their innocence. I do not know how to advise them, as they fear punishment if they resist. Yet their souls are surely being harmed by these actions." Dame Agnes of Huntingdon, who was abbess at Elstow Abbey from 1257 to 1281 AD, was investigated by church officials after accusations were made by several noble families. Letters between Bishop Hugh of Lincoln and the Archbishop of Canterbury mention unseemly conduct with the younger maids and practices that corrupt the innocent. The investigation was quietly concluded after Dame Agnes made a substantial donation to the church, and the families who accused her were threatened with excommunication if they persisted. Lady Isabella de Fortibus, daughter of the Earl of Devon, was taken from Canonsley Abbey in Devon in 1284 AD after she managed to send a coded message to her father about evil touches in the darkness. Her father, William de Fors, wrote to King Edward I, "My daughter speaks of things that cannot be named, of sisters who visit her bed at night and commit unholy acts. When I sought answers from the abbess, she insisted my daughter was mad with religious ecstasy. But I have seen the marks on her skin and the fear in her eyes. I will not abandon her in that place of corruption." Medical attention was primitive and often made things worse. Ill children were treated with bloodletting, purging, and prayer. At Wilton Abbey, the infirmary was a small, windowless stone room with very little heat. Sick children were kept away from the community and left to either recover or die with minimal care. The Abbey chronicler, Sister Melisende, wrote in 1245 AD, "Little Constance has a fever that scorches her skin and causes her to speak in strange tongues. We have bled her 3 times and administered bitter herbs, but she weakens. The abbess says it is God's will, and perhaps her suffering will earn grace for us all." Herbal remedies were used by some older nuns, but their practice was often intertwined with superstition and religious rites. At Amesbury Abbey, Sister Beatrix, the herbalist, kept meticulous records of her treatments. For fever in children, combine wormwood with holy water and blessed salt. If the child's fever persists, apply leeches to the temples while reciting 50 Ave Marias. If the fever breaks, offer thanks to St. Dunstan. If the child dies, offer thanks to God for calling another innocent soul to heaven. The psychological toll of this isolation and abuse was immense. Children who survived into adulthood frequently exhibited what we now identify as trauma responses. They struggled to form relationships, were plagued by nightmares and anxiety, and battled depression. Lady Margaret Beaufort, who spent 3 years at Maxstowe Priory in Warwickshire from 1439 to 1442 AD, wrote in her private prayer book, "I am 30 years of age, and still I wake in terror at the sound of church bells. I still find myself counting the hours between meals. I still move silently through my own house, as if noise might invite punishment. The child I was in that place is gone, but her ghost haunts every moment of my existence." Some children tried to escape, but very few were successful. At Godstow Abbey in 1278 AD, a girl named Mabel of Gloucester tried to run away by hiding in a supply cart headed for Oxford. She was discovered and returned to the abbey, where she was locked in an underground punishment cell for 3 months. The cell was barely big enough for a child to lie down, with no light and very little food. When she was eventually let out, other girls said she could no longer speak clearly and would just rock back and forth, humming aimlessly. Dame Alice of Normandy, who served as abbess at Malling Abbey in Kent from 1289 to 1305 AD, kept a thorough log of escape attempts. Her journal notes, "Young Marie tried to climb the walls during matins. She fell and broke her arm, which I see as God's punishment for her defiance. Catherine attempted to hide in the hay wagons going to Canterbury. She was found and brought back for appropriate correction. Isabel feigned sickness to miss morning prayers, hoping to be taken to the infirmary and escape from there. All these efforts reveal the same wickedness, an unwillingness to submit to God's design for their lives. The most devastating part of these records is witnessing how methodically these children were broken. They came to the convents as individuals with their own personalities, likes, and dreams. They were reshaped into empty containers for religious piety, their spirits shattered by the demand for absolute obedience. At Barking Abbey, the chronicler, Sister Euphemia, wrote with what appears to be satisfaction. "Young Lady Philippa came to us last spring, full of worldly pride and a stubborn will. She often spoke of her silk dresses and her pet falcon. Today, she knelt before me and pleaded for forgiveness for her past vanity. She has asked for her beautiful hair to be cut even shorter, for her meals to be reduced, and for additional penances. God has triumphed over her rebellious heart. This was not education. It was the systematic dismantling of personality and self. Children were taught that their own thoughts were dangerous, their feelings were sinful, and their bodies were shameful. They learned to fear their own minds, distrust their own emotions, and submit to authority without a single question. At Romsey Abbey, the novice mistress, Dame Scholastica, wrote instructions for training young girls. The child must be taught that her will is flawed, her desires are wicked, and her only hope is in total surrender to God's representatives on earth. She must learn to despise what she once cherished, to fear what once gave her joy, and to find peace only in absolute submission." The irony is that many of these children came from affluent, influential families who could have given them excellent educations, comfortable lives, and promising futures. Instead, they were sacrificed for political gain, religious zeal, and the conviction that suffering was somehow purifying. Lady Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of Simon de Montfort, was sent to Amesbury Abbey in 1265 AD at the age of 9 after her father's death in battle. She wrote to her mother, "I had everything a child could desire: books, music, beautiful clothes, and loving servants. Now, I have only cold stone and unending prayers. They say I am blessed, that I am closer to God than those who live in the world. But I feel further from heaven than ever before. For how could a God of love create such sorrow for his smallest children?" Some children manage to hold on to their sanity through small acts of defiance. At Shaftesbury Abbey, archaeological digs in the 1960s found a collection of tiny objects concealed within a dormitory wall. A wooden doll, a shard of colored glass, a pressed flower, and a letter written in a childish script. These were treasures hidden by children who would not let their humanity be completely snuffed out. The letter, written in Norman French, says, "My name is Eleanor. I am 8 years old. I have been in this place for 2 years. I remember my mother's voice as she sang to me. I remember my father's beard on my cheek. I remember my dog, Roussel, who slept at the end of my bed. I write this so someone will know I was here, that I was real, and that I was loved." The long-term effects on these children were catastrophic. Many died young from sickness, malnourishment, or hopelessness. Those who survived to adulthood often struggled with mental illness, an inability to form relationships, and a profound fear of authority. Some became abbesses themselves, continuing the cycle of abuse they had endured. Others, if they finally escaped or were released, found they could not cope in the regular world. Lady Matilda of Gloucester, who spent 8 years at Wilton Abbey, starting in 1245 AD, was finally brought home by her family when she was 16. Her brother, Earl Gilbert, wrote to his mother, "Matilda is so altered I hardly know her. She speaks only in whispers, jumps at loud noises, and will not eat without explicit permission. When I hugged her, she flinched as if I were about to hit her. Whatever they did to her in that place, they have murdered the girl I once knew and left a frightened ghost in her place." The economic side of these arrangements is crucial. Wealthy families paid large dowries to place their daughters in convents, often more than they would have for a marriage. The convents grew into rich institutions, acquiring land, wealth, and political power through these deals. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the account books for 1267 AD show the abbey received over 2,000 marks in dowries for taking in noble daughters, a massive sum for the time. Dame Juliana of Norwich, who was abbess at Carrow Abbey from 1342 to 1359 AD, wrote candidly about the financial motives. "The noble families pay well to be free of their extra daughters. We offer them a holy reason for what is, in truth, abandonment. The children suffer, but our coffers fill, and the church becomes more powerful. I sometimes question if God sanctions this trade of innocence for gold." The most heartbreaking part of these arrangements was how thoroughly the children were forgotten by their own families. Once a girl was in a convent, she effectively ceased to exist for her relatives. Inheritance laws were drafted as if she were dead. Marriage alliances were made without any thought of her. Family records often left out any mention of daughters who had been given to the church. Lady Agnes de Vesey, who was sent to Arden Priory in Yorkshire in 1308 AD at the age of 7, wrote 20 years later, "I have had no word from my family since the day I came here. I do not know if my parents are alive or dead. I do not know if my brothers have married or have children. I am a ghost to them, and they are ghosts to me. Sometimes I wonder if my family was ever real or if I dreamed them in another life." The psychological methods used to break these children were sophisticated and deliberate. They were cut off from everything they knew, constantly watched, punished for showing emotion, and rewarded only for total submission. At Nun Appleton Priory in Yorkshire, the rule stated, "The young maid must be observed at all times, for in solitude she may recall her former life and become sorrowful. When she cries, she must be corrected. When she smiles, she must be questioned. When she talks of home, she must be punished. Only when she displays neither joy nor sadness, but perfect indifference to all earthly matters, has she reached the proper state of grace." Modern psychologists would identify these methods as systematic psychological abuse, engineered to create learned helplessness and total dependency. The children were taught that they were powerless, that resistance was pointless, and that their only hope was in absolute obedience to their keepers. At Barking Abbey, the novice mistress dame Euphemia wrote, "A properly trained child should move like a shadow, speak like an echo, and think like a prayer book. She should have no wants of her own, no opinions of her own, no dreams of her own. She should be an empty vessel, ready to be filled with God's will as conveyed by her superiors. The rare stories of children who kept their spirit alive despite years of abuse are especially moving. Lady Marguerite de Clare, who spent 6 years at Amesbury Abbey beginning in 1282 AD, secretly kept a journal in a coded script she invented. Her entries show a child fighting to hold onto her identity against overwhelming pressure. They have taken my name and call me Sister Scholastica. They have taken my hair and covered my head with rough fabric. They have taken my voice and demand silence. But they cannot take my thoughts, though they try. In my mind, I am still Marguerite. I still love the feel of silk and the taste of honey. I still remember my mother's laugh and my father's stories. They may possess my body, but my soul is still mine. The complicity of families in these arrangements is perhaps the most difficult part to understand. Parents who profess to love their children knowingly sent them to places where they would suffer. The letters between parents and abbesses show a shocking lack of concern for the children's well-being. Lord Hugh de Mortimer wrote to the abbess of a Conbury priory in 1278 AD, "I send my daughter Isabel to your care. She is willful and given to laughter, faults which I trust you will remedy with appropriate discipline. Do not hold back the rod, for I would prefer a godly daughter to a happy 1-inch Lady Joan de Geneville wrote to her daughter at Amesbury Abbey in 1290 AD. I am happy to hear you have learned submission and no longer cry for your old life. Your suffering now will earn you ease in the life to come. Remember that earthly happiness is temporary, but heavenly reward is forever. Endure your trials with patience, and know that I am proud of your sacrifice." These letters show parents who had convinced themselves they were doing what was best for their children, that suffering was somehow good for them, that breaking a child's spirit was an act of love. The psychological justifications they used are disturbingly similar to those of abusers throughout history. The claim that pain is necessary, that it builds character, that it serves a higher cause. The medical results of these harsh conditions were severe and well documented. At Wilton Abbey, death records show that almost half of all children admitted died before reaching adulthood. The causes were varied but predictable: malnutrition, disease, exposure, and what the chroniclers gently called a failure to thrive. Modern doctors would recognize these deaths as the result of systematic neglect and abuse. Sister Marguerite, the infirmarian at Shaftesbury Abbey, wrote in 1289 AD, "Young Beatrix grows thinner each day, despite our efforts to feed her. She cannot keep food down and talks constantly of her mother. I fear her body is failing because her spirit is broken." The abbess says, "This is God's will, but I have seen many children sicken and die this way. Their bodies seem to surrender when their hearts are destroyed." The concept of failure to thrive was not known in medieval times, but the symptoms were clearly seen. Children who could not adjust to the harsh environment would gradually waste away, losing weight, becoming listless, and eventually dying with no clear physical cause. Our modern understanding of trauma would see these deaths as the result of severe psychological stress causing physical symptoms. Educational chances for these children were minimal and centered entirely on religious teaching. At Lacock Abbey, the curriculum was memorizing Latin prayers, learning to read basic religious texts, and gaining simple skills in embroidery and manuscript copying. There was no teaching in math, science, history, or literature outside of religious works. The aim was not to educate, but to indoctrinate. Dame Ella of Salisbury, the founder of Lacock Abbey, wrote in 1232 AD, "Let the young maids learn only what is needed for the service of God. Too much learning creates pride, and pride is the root of all sin. It is better they stay ignorant of worldly knowledge and pure in their faith than clever in their speech and corrupt in their hearts." This intentional limiting of education served several functions. It kept the children reliant on their religious teachers, stopped them from developing critical thinking skills that might lead to questioning authority, and made sure they would not be able to function on their own in the outside world. Children who had been raised in convents from a young age often found themselves completely unequipped for secular life if they were ever let go. The physical conditions in these institutions were often intentionally severe. Cold stone floors, unheated dormitories and minimal furniture were thought to build character. At Godstow Abbey, a visiting bishop in 1278 AD described the dormitory as colder than a tomb and darker than a dungeon. The beds were straw pallets on the floor with thin woolen blankets that gave little warmth. Windows were few and small, creating a constant twilight that added to the feeling of gloom and depression. Water for washing was limited and often frozen in winter. Children were expected to stay clean with few resources, and failing to do so led to punishment. At Romsey Abbey, the rules said, "Cleanliness is next to godliness, but comfort is the enemy of devotion. The young maid shall wash in cold water and find joy in their discomfort, for it reminds them of their mortal nature and their need for divine grace." The psychological effect of constant discomfort cannot be ignored. Children who are cold, hungry, and uncomfortable cannot focus on learning or spiritual growth. They become obsessed with their physical needs, creating a cycle of suffering that goes against the very goals the institutions claim to have. At Barking Abbey, a visiting physician noted in 1285 AD, the children here are so focused on their bodily discomfort that they cannot pay attention to their prayers. They shiver through Mass, fidget during lessons, and dream of warmth instead of salvation. Social isolation was another method of control. Children were forbidden from making friends, discouraged from showing affection, and punished for being loyal to anyone but their religious superiors. At Elstow Abbey, the rules stated, "Particular friendships are the devil's trap. The young maid shall love all equally and none specially. They shall not give gifts, share secrets, or show preference for any companion. Their hearts must be saved for God alone." This isolation caused deep loneliness and despair. Children who had been taken from loving families were surrounded by other children, but could not form real connections. The natural human need for companionship and affection was treated as sinful, creating more guilt and shame. Lady Alice de Lacy, who spent 5 years at Nun Appleton Priory starting in 1301 AD, wrote, "I'm surrounded by other children, but I am more alone than if I were the only person on earth. We are forbidden to comfort each other, to share our sorrows, to offer friendship. We are like islands in a sea of silence, each drowning in our own despair." The long-term psychological effects of this systematic abuse were severe. Children who survived to adulthood often showed symptoms that modern psychologists would identify as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. They had trouble trusting others, forming relationships, and living independently. Many became abusers themselves, unable to imagine raising children without harsh discipline and emotional deprivation. Dame Margaret of Anjou, who became abbess of Amesbury Abbey in 1315 AD after growing up there, wrote to a fellow abbess, "I know no other way to train children than how I was trained. The rod and the harsh word were my teachers, and they will be the teachers to the children in my care. I sometimes wonder if there could be gentler ways, but I fear that kindness creates weakness, and weakness creates sin." The cyclical nature of abuse was very clear in the religious orders. Women who had been brutalized as children often became the brutalizers of the next generation, continuing systems of cruelty that lasted for centuries. At Shaftesbury Abbey, the same methods of discipline and control were used from the 12th century until the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, passed down from one generation of abbesses to the next like a deadly inheritance. The economic exploitation of these children was also significant. Their labor was valuable to the convents, and they were expected to work long hours on top of their religious duties. At Wilton Abbey, girls as young as 7 were put to work in the scriptorium, where they spent hours copying manuscripts in cramped conditions that damaged their eyesight and stunted their growth. The Abbey's account books show that the sale of manuscripts copied by child labor brought in a lot of money for the institution. Lady Constance of Brittany, who spent 7 years at Wilton Abbey, starting in 1287 AD, wrote, "My hands are permanently stained with ink from countless hours of copying. My back is bent from hunching over manuscripts. My eyes are strained from trying to see in dim light. We are not students here. We are laborers dressed as novices, The children who worked in the kitchens were no better off. At Barking Abbey, girls as young as 6 were assigned to help prepare meals, working with sharp knives and boiling water with little supervision. Burns and cuts were common and were treated with little sympathy. The Abbey chronicler noted, young Matilda burned her arm badly while stirring the porridge. She endured the pain without crying, which shows proper spiritual development. Pain teaches patience, and patience teaches devotion. Perhaps the most tragic were the children who never fully broke, who kept some spark of their original selves despite years of systematic abuse. These children often suffer the most, as their resistance was seen as proof of spiritual corruption that needed even more severe correction. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Joanna of Winchester spent 3 years in various forms of punishment for her refusal to stop asking about her family. She was eventually locked in a cell so small she couldn't stand up, fed only bread and water, and denied all human contact except for daily questioning about her willingness to submit. The records of her questioning, kept in the Abbey's disciplinary files, show a child of amazing courage being slowly destroyed by institutional cruelty. I asked again if God truly wants children to suffer, she told her interrogators. I asked why prayer feels like poison in my mouth. I asked why I dream of my mother's face if I am supposed to forget her. These questions come from my heart, not from the devil. Why is my heart so evil? After 6 months of solitary confinement, Johanna's questions ceased. She came out of her cell silent and obedient, her eyes empty of the fire that once burned there. The Abbey chronicler wrote with satisfaction, Johanna has finally achieved the proper state of submission. She no longer asks troubling questions or speaks of her former life. God has conquered her rebellious spirit, but this conquest was not salvation. It was destruction. These children were not being prepared for heaven. They were being prepared for a hell on earth, trained to accept suffering as normal, abuse as love, and silence as a virtue. The very qualities that made them human, curiosity, affection, hope, were systematically crushed in the name of holiness. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s finally freed many of these children. But for most, freedom came too late. Women who had spent their whole lives in convents were unable to function in the outside world. They had no practical skills, no understanding of secular life, and no ability to form normal relationships. Many became beggars, others retreated into hermitages, and some went mad from the shock of sudden freedom. Lady Margaret Pole, who had been imprisoned at Sion Abbey as a child, wrote after the dissolution, "They have opened the cage, but the bird has forgotten how to fly. I stand in sunlight and feel only fear. I hear laughter and do not understand its meaning. I am free, but I am not alive. They killed the child I was so completely that no woman could grow from her remains." The stories of these children remind us that institutional abuse is not a modern problem. The systematic destruction of childhood in the name of a higher purpose has ancient origins, and the justifications used by medieval abbesses echo through the centuries in the words of every authority figure who has ever claimed that cruelty serves a noble end. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, remember the children who slept on cold stone floors, who cried silent tears into straw pillows, who dreamed of mothers' faces they were forbidden to remember. Remember that these were not distant figures from a barbaric past. They were children, like any children, with the same needs for love, comfort, and kindness that children have always had. Their voices were silenced, their names forgotten, their suffering dismissed as a holy sacrifice. But in the margins of manuscripts, in the cracks between stones, in the whispered confessions of dying nuns, their stories survive. They remind us that the price of unquestioned authority is always paid by the most vulnerable, and that no cause, no matter how sacred, justifies the destruction of a child's soul. The bells that once called them to prayer have long since fallen silent. The stone walls that imprisoned them have crumbled. The abbesses who tormented them have turned to dust. But the echo of their suffering remains, a warning from the past that childhood is sacred that innocence deserves protection, and that any system that systematically destroys the young in the name of salvation is itself damned. You wake to the sound of bells cutting through the darkness. But this time, you do not wake alone in a cold dormitory surrounded by frightened children. You wake in a world where childhood is valued, where children's voices matter, where suffering is not mistaken for sanctity. The bells that ring now call not to enforce prayer, but to memory, a memory of those who had no choice, no voice, no escape from the stone fortresses that promised heaven but delivered only hell. Remember them. Remember their names when you can find them. Remember their pain when records preserve it. Remember their courage when it flickered briefly before being extinguished. Remember that they were children first, victims second, and statistics never. In remembering, we honor not just their suffering, but their humanity. And in honoring their humanity, we guard against the return of systems that would sacrifice children on the altar of any cause, no matter how noble it claims to be.